So this brings us to the concluding part of our lecture on the Roman period, the period of empire, now also referring to the fact that increasingly, the Senate still exists at this point, but increasingly power comes to reside in the hands of a single individual, who we might note doesn't actually take the title of emperor initially. That'll come later. So the first individual, of course, is Octavian, after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He proclaims, in fact, a restoration of the Republic. This is in 17 B.C.E. But in fact, it will be anything but a republic. He's given the title Augustus, and generally speaking, that's probably, it's not technically a name, but that ends up kind of being how he's often referenced historically. It's a title meaning the revered one. It's actually an informal title too. The actual formal title that he takes if the Senate awards him is princeps, meaning chief citizen or first among equals. So what ensues is often referred to now as the Age of Augustus. And he does prove to be a very effective leader. We should even say ruler. This will be a prosperous time for the Roman Empire. It will continue to expand. And it obviously will carry on for quite a while after him, but he proves to be quite good. The title of princeps, by the way, technically carried no power. So related to that, Augustus is actually made consul in order that he might actually have imperium, the right to command. In 23 BCE, he gives up the consulship, but is nonetheless granted meius imperium, meaning greater right to command. And again, I want to stress that the Senate still exists. In theory, it still is a very important governing body, but it is completely controlled by Augustus. I mean, you simply cannot be elected to the Senate if you don't enjoy his support. He's an extremely popular individual with the Roman people. As a senator, you basically end up rubber stamping whatever Augustus has decided, right? I mean, he, in effect, almost governing by decree, but there's still kind of the fiction that the Senate has given whatever he's decreed its seal of approval. Now, as I mentioned, the Roman Empire will continue to expand during this period, though it is very rapidly approaching its maximum extent. Of course, a big factor in this is the expansion of the Roman army. At the time of Augustus, you have a standing army of 28 legions, each consisting of 5,400 soldiers for a total of about 150,000 men. And by the way, service in the Roman army is no minor affair. If you're a Roman legionnaire, you're serving for 20 years. And again, you have to be a citizen, in this case now, meaning mostly individuals residing in Italy. Now, there is a possibility of fighting alongside the Roman army as an auxiliary, and in fact, you have about 130,000 men from different parts of the Roman Empire, all of them non-citizens who are recruited to fight in this capacity, and they usually serve for 24 years. The really major incentive for doing this kind of service is that not just you, but your families would receive citizenship after terms of service. So this, by the way, also becomes a kind of channel or mechanism for the Romanization of the empire. First of all, as a kind of incentive to, really become much more integrated into Roman society. But second of all, also you have legions that are established throughout the empire, very often at garrisons. And then very often individuals who retire end up becoming colonizers of other parts of the empire. So you have many colonies that are made up of veterans, and with them comes the spread of Roman culture and also the Roman language, Latin. And the process of Romanization doesn't stop there. So in most cases, in provinces that are established in the far-flung corners of the empire, the governor would have been a Roman citizen, but very dependent on local authorities for carrying out their duties. So these individuals would come to constitute a kind of local elite, and part of that would be adopting Roman ways, Roman culture, and of course learning to use Latin. In some of the cities, the city councils would come to constitute a kind of ruling elite, a local elite made up of leading citizens, and these individuals also would tend to adopt Roman custom, use of the Latin language, and so forth. So this becomes all part of a process of Romanization. Now, very often, as the empire does continue to expand, new territories might kind of go through a two-stage process before becoming fully integrated into the Roman Empire. They very often would come to constitute client kingdoms that, in some degree, were independent but did accept the kind of overlordship of Rome and would act on the interests of Rome. Later on, at some point, the empire is going to kind of hit its limit, and at that point, policy will become more about maintaining frontiers. And we might here take a look at the empire as it existed during Augustus's reign. It's really coming very close to the maximum expansion that it will ever achieve. Maybe conquering a little bit more territory in parts of modern day, what corresponds to modern day Germany, in the center there, large parts of Britain, pretty much corresponding to present day England and Wales, never able to take the territory currently connected with Scotland. But at that point, it's pretty much going to hit the limit of its expansion. Now, a good question at this point might be like, it would appear many people actually were quite happy to be part of the Roman Empire. So why is that? And a lot of it had to do with a kind of social mobility that really became established in a kind of more formal way during the reign of Augustus, right? Where he kind of established a number of different social orders that constitute a kind of hierarchy. But the thing is, you had the possibility of moving from one to the next. So at the very top would have been the senatorial order, which constituted the ruling class of the empire. This would have been the, obviously members of the Senate, but also the highest governing officials, chief government, and military positions throughout the empire. So in a sense, the Senate now is really kind of defining, a way of defining that someone has kind of achieved the highest position in the social hierarchy, right? To some degree political, but increasingly power is coming to reside in the hands of a single individual. Below the senatorial order would have been the equestrian order, which was connected to the cavalry. And so they had existed for a while, but now this particular group is expanded and given a greater share in power and becomes pretty much open to all Roman citizens of property. They do hold positions in government, but kind of one step down from the senatorial order. Below that would have been assemblies representing the lower classes, and they had less power. And the basic idea is that if you became very successful at one level, you could eventually advance to the next. Or if not you, at least maybe your son, right? And very often Romans thought more in terms of advancing the family than advancing as an individual. So we could say that this is this kind of social mobility, the manner in which it's been structured, kind of the Roman equivalent of what today we refer to in the U.S. as the American dream, right? That many people accept perhaps being in a rather poor position because they believe if they work hard, that eventually you'll be rewarded, or if not you, then your children will achieve a better position. As long as people have a stake in the system, right, kind of understand the rules of the game, you believe that there is a possibility for advancement, you're willing to accept the existing social order. So same basic deal in the Roman period. Of course, today a lot of people are very frustrated. They feel that the system is rigged and so forth, right? So it's kind of basically what they're saying is that, there is this idea about how things are supposed to work, but they're not working the way they should. Now, we mentioned this was kind of the age of Augustus. We might also say that the golden age of Latin literature roughly corresponds to that. And so probably the most preeminent figures in Roman literature are going to be operating during this period. At the very top would be Virgil, probably the most distinguished poet of the entire history of Rome, but certainly of the Augustan age, and most famous for his greatest work, which was the Aeneid. Basically, he wanted to write a myth about the founding of Rome that would be the Roman equivalent to the works of Homer. I mean, what Homer was to the Greeks, he would be to the Romans. And related to this, he actually, in creating this myth, tried to connect Rome with Troy, with the story of the Iliad, the idea that one Trojan, a fellow named Aeneas, had actually escaped and eventually had set sail for the Italian peninsula and laid the foundation for Rome. But in this case, it was a myth that everyone understood was an invented story. And in some ways, the point of the Aeneid was also to celebrate Rome. In particular, he felt that this was a way of a kind of propaganda regarding what he considered to be Rome's gift for ruling. Another very important figure from this period, and a friend of Virgil's, was a fellow named Horace. He was a little bit more critical of Roman society. So for instance, he would often attack using satire what he considered to be the follies, i.e. foolishness, and vices, or bad behavior of his contemporaries. And in fact, probably his most important work in this regard is simply entitled The Satires, a collection of poems on human weaknesses. And hopefully most of us are aware of what satire is. It's usually when you try to critique something in a negative way, perhaps through comedy or through exaggeration, right? You might consider some of the skits on Saturday Night Live are a kind of satire. Another work for which Horace is famous is the Epistles, which are imaginary letters written to his friends and addressed to society as a whole about what he felt were the most important values in life, right? The kind of, also what he felt encompassed what were, in a pure sense, Roman values, right? An appreciation of the simple life, living in the countryside, enjoying good company, good food, good wine, not aspiring to things like power and fame and so forth. Another important figure is Ovid, who wrote the Amoris and the Metamorphoses. The Amoris kind of having to do with love. The Metamorphoses, very important from the perspective of our knowledge about Roman and Greek mythology. Basically collected a lot of what was known at the time into one work. So much of what we know about this mythology comes through Ovid. A lesser work, but in some ways more interesting, he wrote a book called The Art of Love, essentially an instruction manual on how to seduce women. And this actually drew the ire or disfavor of Augustus, who was really trying to promote good Roman values. He kind of argued that the elite had an obligation to set an example for those below them. And so, this work, which seemed to be encouraging promiscuous behavior, adultery, and so forth, didn't really fit with his program. And this actually saw Ovid being sent into exile because Augustus was so upset about this. And with regard to literary figures, we might conclude with Livy, because after all, I am a historian, and he is probably the most famous historian from the Roman period. He wrote a history of Rome from its foundation to his own time, or close to it, roughly 9 B.C.E., which consisted, believe it or not, of 142 books. So he's a prose writer. He's not writing in poetic form. And we should note that many of these books are no longer with us. But, I mean, this is proper history, right? He really tried to understand the history of Rome, developments in that history as reflecting the actions taken by humans, human character, and, but this is also kind of what we might call a conventional kind of political history, where you focus on important individuals. But nonetheless, right, a very important source. In fact, many of the primary sources that we're aware of, the originals no longer exist, but he very often incorporated them into his own work, so kind of, a way of preserving those as well. This brings us to what might be considered eventually, I mean, there's going to be, after Augustus, there is actually kind of a period of decline, where even they go through a large number of emperors very rapidly. Simply put, a lot of them are really ineffective. Some spectacularly so, like Nero, very often famous for apparently not really wanting to be an emperor, wanted to be an actor, but was very brutal, would basically torture or execute anyone who fell into disfavor with him. And during his reign, Rome would actually at some point catch fire. Very famous for supposedly fiddling while Rome burned, but eventually Rome came out of this kind of negative period and entered a stretch where they had in sequence 5 really effective emperors. So this was kind of like one of the most prosperous periods for the Roman Empire. We often call it the period of the 5 good emperors, running from 96 to 180 CE. And sometimes we also refer to this as a period of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, the idea that Rome had imposed upon the entire Mediterranean world a tremendous stability on account of which everyone benefited. So the five good emperors begin with Nerva. So he only ruled for 2 years, but nonetheless, he kind of represents the beginning of a kind of restabilizing of the political situation. He was chosen by the Senate after the assassination of his predecessor Domitian. Probably the most important decision he made was choosing his own successor, his adopted son Marcus Ulpius Nerva Trajan. Right, so he chose someone who was actually very capable and would prove to be an effective emperor. Very often we just simply refer to him as Trajan, who ruled from 117 to 138. So we're going to drop the CE. From this point onward, we're in the Common Era. He's, interestingly enough, the first emperor born outside of Italy. But whatever that, wherever he came from, he proved to be a very capable ruler. He was acceptable to the army, and there's kind of an understanding at this point that whoever was emperor had to be accepted by the army. He's going to be succeeded by his second cousin Hadrian, who again proves to be very effective. Spent years inspecting the provinces and restoring the military forces to good order, really worked hard on strengthening the frontier defenses, most famously in Britain, where they built a wall, Hadrian's Wall, which is still there. It's rather low, right? The point of the wall wasn't to actually keep people out, but more was kind of the idea that you could then station soldiers at little forts up and down the wall. This would kind of facilitate their ability to move back and forth and also kind of clearly demarcate what was the frontier. And finally, we have Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161, and Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180. Some consider Antonius Pius to be the most beneficent, meaning kind of the one who cared the most about his people and really worked hard to make sure that they were taken care of. And Marcus Aurelius often equated with the philosopher king. He just seemed to embody this whole kind of idea that Plato had put forth about the perfect ruler, right? Someone who had absolute authority, in this case as emperor, but had a great deal of wisdom, and again also much concerned about the well-being of his subjects. And during this period, the empire really does kind of hit its greatest extent. It's not going to go. You kind of have this idea at some point that the proper boundary in the north is pretty much the Rhine and Danube rivers, right? The Rhine River, you can kind of see it roughly where you see those two arrows is that little river just headed directly south. And then below Dacia, you can see the Danube River. And these come to be kind of perceived as really the proper borders of the Roman Empire, sometimes taking a little bit of territory on the other side, but really never trying to extend the territory under Roman control much beyond that. So while all of this is happening, this period of the five emperors, the Roman army is getting bigger and bigger, eventually numbering about 400,000 altogether by the end of the 2nd century. And the Roman Empire, probably more than anything, the most important mechanism or channel for Romanization of the empire, particularly as they have to kind of expand citizenship. A lot of Italians increasingly reluctant to serve in the military, so they're really starting to look elsewhere, other provinces, for recruitment. And again, maintaining the idea that you have to be a citizen to be a soldier. Now, as I mentioned, right, the Roman army is going to be very important with respect to spreading Roman culture, the Latin language, just Roman ways in general. So Roman military camps become very important in this regard. Military camps, meaning very often garrisons would be established on the frontier or at what were considered to be important junctures with respect to maintaining the ability of the military to move around. And some of these would eventually develop into cities, right? So I mean, very often a garrison or a large fort or fortress would be established. So there'd be a lot of people living there, and then merchants and traders and so forth, other kinds of individuals would begin to set up camp around them. And before you knew it, they would evolve into cities. And actually, a lot of cities in Europe today started this way. For instance, along the Rhine River, you have the cities of Cologne and Trier in Germany. So here, And these are just two examples, right? So you have on the bottom the modern city of Cologne in Germany. Obviously, the cathedral you see there was not built during the Roman period. But if you go to Cologne today, by the way, and that is where the word Cologne comes from. In German, they say Kölnwasser, or Cologne water. But if you go there today, they have actually a very impressive archaeological site and related museum from the Roman period. The other image, we see the Augusta Treverorum in Trier, which dates back to the Roman period, right? So Roman culture beginning to spread, and we might think again about kind of what that actually looks like on the ground, right? So definitely this is evident with respect to art and architecture. And again, we already talked about how the Greeks were heavily influential, for instance, in the use of colonnades, these kind of very often semi-open areas in the front that have many columns around the perimeter, the use of rectangular structures, but some things that they kind of introduced. For instance, the Romans like to use curvilinear forms, kind of more rounded shapes, something evident in particular with the arches, vaults, and domes that became common features of Roman architecture. And in each case, they didn't invent these forms, but they really did perfect them also from an engineering point of view, the ability to utilize these forms on a much grander scale. Part of this is they were actually the first people to ever use concrete on a large scale. And this really allowed for building things that could actually be much bigger and could actually stand up. Like with a dome, for instance, the bigger the dome becomes, right, there's always a danger that its own weight is going to cause it to collapse. And that brings us back to the Pantheon in Rome, where we can see both the Greek influence but also elements that are distinct to the Romans, such as the dome in the back. And if we take a closer look at it, right, so we see the dome here, the interior, and it really does. I was there not too long ago. It really pretty much looks exactly like this, except the people inside wouldn't be wearing togas. And it's entirely made of concrete, right? I mean, if it were stone, even as concrete, it's 5,000 tons, right? But it would weigh much more if it were made of stone. Nonetheless, right, I mean, the walls holding it up are still very sturdy, about 20 feet thick, but this would really be almost impossible if using a different material. And speaking of Roman architecture, right, I mean, this is also where we're going to see a lot of building on a grand scale. Some of this has to do with this kind of tradition that's developing that the Roman emperors have a responsibility for keeping the people of Rome, many of whom are unemployed or unable to find any kind of stable employment, to make sure that they're taken care of, right, to keeping them fed and entertained. Most important with respect to entertainment is going to be the Colosseum, an amphitheater constructed under Vespasian and Titus. The name actually comes from a statue that used to stand nearby, the Colossus of Nero. And even today, this is one of the most famous structures that one finds in Rome, right in the center of the city. Obviously in a state of disrepair because a lot of the stone would be borrowed for other structures during the Middle Ages, but nonetheless remaining impressive. And all kinds of entertainment would have taken place there. We'll come to that in a second. But of course, the other part of it was this kind of idea that the emperors were responsible for feeding the population of Rome. And so this kind of began with Augustus, but this just becomes the common practice. So about 200,000 Romans would have received free grain on a regular basis. And this required on average about 6 million sacks of grain a year, mostly imported from Africa and Egypt. It might surprise some people that North Africa, inclusive of Egypt, was actually the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Now, having said that, the living conditions of most people living in Rome were pretty poor. I mean, very grim. You were probably living in very crowded conditions, living in homes that very easily could fall down or catch fire, very unsanitary conditions. Yet people would still flock to Rome. This was considered the place to be. And part of it had to do with the tremendous possibilities possibilities with respect to entertainment. So you kind of have this idea that the Roman emperors, in order to prevent any kind of uprising or rebellion, had to provide bread and circuses, right? The bread obviously referring to feeding them, circuses keeping them distracted with entertainment, right? You need to entertain the masses, and there were three major types of entertainment. The first was the horse and chariot races. Second, theater performances, very similar to what we saw in ancient Greece. But then finally, and most popularly, the gladiatorial shows such as you found at the Colosseum. Another very large structure, right? I mean, we're talking, these amphitheaters could hold, between 50 to 90,000 people, right? So, something comparable to sports stadiums today. Circus Maximus would have held up to 90,000, the site of horse and chariot races. But again, most popular were the gladiatorial shows, and this was as ruthless as you might have imagined, right? These were fights to the death. Here we see someone looking to the emperor for the signal about whether he should kill or allow his opponent to survive. Contrary to popular opinion, thumbs down actually, if you're the guy lying on the ground, thumbs up would have been bad, right? Thumbs up basically is the signal to go ahead and kill him. So you would prefer thumbs down if you're in that position. So after the period of the five emperors, you could say we're hitting a period of one step forward, two steps back decline. So I mean, it's going to, something that's going to play out over a long period of time. But overall, particularly with hindsight, it's evident that the empire has entered a period of decline. Something perhaps evident in the fact that you have, I don't want to say, I wrote continuous civil war, but very, seems more often there's some kind of civil conflict taking place than not. At one point, you have 25 emperors over a period of 5 decades, a pretty clear indication of growing instability. Eventually, other factors come into play. The monetary system begins to collapse due to a debasing of coinage, like we're using less precious metal in their making. It would be kind of the equivalent of today printing money. And this is partly inspired by the fact that the government is finding it difficult to pay soldiers in cash. Farm production is going to start to deteriorate. At some point, you're running into the problem of mostly Germanic barbarians that are beginning to press in on the frontier, many of them spilling over into Roman territory and then kind of ravaging agricultural fields and so forth. In some cases, even the Roman army is getting in on the action. This might also reflect that the army is increasingly dependent on barbarians, who, in the past it hadn't been uncommon earlier that barbarians would enter the army, but it would be as individuals who would become Romanized. Increasingly, you're having entire tribes that are now incorporated into the army who continue to kind of maintain a sense of their own separate identity, and they don't really have any strong sense of loyalty to the empire or emperors. Right? So it's kind of, as long as it's in their interest to be supportive of the empire, then you can count on them. Otherwise, maybe not. So this becomes a period of instability. One way that many people living in the Roman Empire deal with this is becoming more religious. Very popular during this period are going to be what are known as mystery cults, very often brought back to Rome by soldiers who had been serving in some far-flung corner. Like probably one of the most popular ones for a while is the cult of Isis, right, of the Egyptian goddess Isis. Though also another very popular cult was the cult of Cybele, right? And so very often they would have these kind of mysterious rituals that only the initiated would be aware of, and this kind of feeling that if you went through them, you were somehow constituted a kind of special, knowledgeable group of people. And these cults were primarily there to address kind of individual needs about the meaning of life, what's it all about, how to carry on in a world that appears to be falling apart, what happens to you after you die, and so forth. One mystery cult, though, that is eventually going to basically, in terms of support, outnumber any other, is going to be what eventually comes to constitute the Christian faith. So in order to talk about that, we need to first look at another group of people, the Jewish people, who at some point had come under Roman rule. Roman involvement with the Jews began in 63 BCE, and at that point you still had the province of Judea. It had been under Hellenistic rule for a while, but for the most part, the Jews living there had been allowed to, practice their faith and manage their own affairs. Now they came under Roman rule, and the Romans are going to be a little bit more actively involved in how things are done. And part of that has to do with the fact that the Romans don't care if you have your own religious practices and so forth, and to a very large extent, as long as you don't actually revolt against Roman rule, they don't care what you do. But they do expect that you should take part in certain kind of state-based cults related to Rome or the Roman gods. And the idea, this would be kind of a way of expressing your loyalty to Rome. And many Jews and later on Christians are going to have a problem with this, right? Because, one of the first commandments is, thou shalt have no other God before me. And so a lot of Jews are going to resist this idea, that, well, I can, worship my own God. You still have the temple at this point in Jerusalem. But meanwhile, you have to somehow participate in these kind of Roman rituals. In any event, by 6 CE, Judea was a Roman province, started out as a client state. This is actually probably the most famous ruler during that period would be Herod, who's often associated with the life of Jesus, but also with the reconstruction of the temple. Eventually, the Jews are going to revolt against the Romans in 66. And that's going to lead to their utter destruction, culminating with the destruction of the temple. It's completely destroyed in 70 CE. The image you see there is kind of a fortress located on a high plateau near the Dead Sea called Masada, where the Jews will take their final stand. And right before the Romans actually were able to take control of it, all the Jews who were holding out there committed suicide rather than being taken by the Romans. So it's kind of a very famous episode in the history of the Jewish people. Actually became a kind of symbol for the Israeli state and kind of symbol of Jewish resistance in more modern times. Well, that brings us to Christianity. And so we should note that during the time of Jesus, there were a number of different sects within Judaism. Probably the most two famous were the Sadducees and the Pharisees. So in many respects, from a historian's point of view, there's kind of the view that Jesus probably represented a particular sect. Now, according to Christian tradition, Jesus came from the city of Nazareth, though had been born in the city of Bethlehem. So he was Jewish and grew up in the Galilee region. Then at some point went around preaching kind of a new, we're not sure, exactly, from historians' point of view, exactly how much of the belief system of Christianity was promoted by him or developed later in connection with him. Most historians feel, in fact, it's kind of hard to confirm that he even existed. We have no non-Christian sources, right? So from a historian's perspective, we're pretty sure he did exist, but you can't say that, there's no kind of Roman source referring to Jesus that would corroborate religious sources. And so, the closest we have to that are sources that can at least confirm that you had followers of someone named Jesus one generation down the road. In any event, like most historians feel, there probably was someone named Jesus. We're pretty sure that there are kind of certain values he promoted, such as humility, charity, and brotherly love, which, by the way, would have been, quite perceived as being quite different from Greco-Roman values, particularly, this idea of humility. If you think about one of the heroes of the ancient Greek and Roman world, Achilles, right, not considered to be very humble. And so this would become the basis of a value system for medieval civilization. In some ways, if we're talking about the development of the Christian faith in terms of specific beliefs about Jesus, the idea that he is God incarnate, that he is both human and divine in equal measure, the idea, the expansion of Christianity from being just one of a number of different Jewish sects into a completely new religion through his promotion among non-Jews, people who would have been referred to as Gentiles back in the day. In some ways, you could argue the most important individual is a follower of Jesus who came later. Originally named Saul, but who had a vision where Jesus spoke to him, supposedly on the road to Damascus. He was actually someone heavily persecuting Christians at the time. But supposedly after the vision, he had a change of heart, converted to the new faith, and then would greatly promote it among non-Jews. This individual is Paul the Apostle, who would go on to found many Christian communities throughout Asia Minor. Those of you familiar with the Christian Bible, the first 4 chapters, known as the Gospels or the Good News, are effectively 4 different biographies about the life of Jesus. But then after that, among other chapters, you have a series of letters attributed to Paul that actually most historians feel probably did come from him, where he was communicating with and promoting the spread of Christianity, but communicating with various Christian communities throughout Asia Minor. So he was kind of the guy they would go to when they had questions about, specifically what should they believe, how should they behave, and so forth. So he's considered to be, at the very least, the second founder of Christianity after Jesus. And eventually Christianity is going to begin to spread fairly rapidly. So, in a sense, by way of summarizing some main points, the state of the Christian faith at its beginning. So from an early point, right, you had this idea that there were a number of different biographies known as Gospels, again, the good news concerning the life of Jesus. Actually, there were more than 4, but eventually the church leadership would decide that only 4 were completely reliable, would become what you call canon, right, would be incorporated into the Christian Bible, and those were the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Also incorporated into the Bible would be Paul's letters or epistles, where he outlined the beliefs of the early Christians, but also provide a lot of commentary when trying to address concerns of the early Christian communities about what it meant to be a Christian, the kind of values they had, and so forth. A very important event in terms of kind of Christianity going off in its own direction entirely was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 by the Romans. Up until that point, Jerusalem had been kind of a headquarters to the various Christian churches being established elsewhere. After that, they pretty much were kind of cut loose, right? So they all became much more independent, kind of operating on their own. It's also as kind of as a consequence of the temple's destruction, the leadership of the Jewish community had to kind of rethink what it meant to be a Jew, inasmuch as the sacrifice and rituals of the temple had been kind of at the core. From that point on, that was no longer possible. But they also actually took a decided position regarding Christian belief, the idea that Jesus was somehow the Messiah or somehow the incarnation of God on earth. Something the leadership rejected, the idea that if that's what you believe, you really cannot be considered a Jew anymore. So in a sense, both moving away from each other for different reasons. We should note the early Christians were initially mostly Jews who were heavily influenced by Greek culture, as we would say Hellenized. It's probably not a surprise that when they finally wrote down what would become the New Testament, it was primarily in Greek, later to be translated into Latin as the religion spread throughout the empire. So what do we know about the early Christian communities? We know that probably central to their coming together in recognition of one another would have been the shared common meal and agape. And that probably reflects in part that depending on time and place, there was a chance he would be persecuted for being overtly Christian. And we'll talk a bit about that later in another chapter. But this is kind of one way that you could kind of share your Christian belief without, really kind of making it overtly, very openly known that you're a Christian. We know that the probably most important sacrament or Christian ritual from an early point was the Eucharist. Those of you who have been to church, particularly if you're Catholic, probably familiar with this. It's the idea that you take from the bread and wine, and that in the moment that you do this, the bread becomes the body of Christ, and the wine, in a kind of mystical way, becomes the blood of Christ, kind of in reference to an event in the life of Jesus known as the Last Supper. We know that particularly when these various churches initially were operating independently of one another, each would have its own individual hierarchy, would be headed up by boards of elders known as presbyters. Later on, coming into the 2nd century, there's going to be kind of an attempt to bring the churches together into one unified body, which would also have a broader hierarchy, wherein the position of bishop develops, right, where the bishop would actually exercise authority over presbyters, would have authority over a large number of individual churches within a particular district. In any event, that kind of concludes our discussion for chapter 6. We're shortly moving over to China, but we will eventually return to Europe and consider developments related to the growth of Christianity in Europe, among other things.